So there's now a photo mode in Deathloop, and I want to know, is the photo mode any good? My name is Mir, and let's find out, shall we? Welcome back to photo mode perspective. Let's get to an open area and see what this photo mode is like. I think I want to stand on top of that crane, because why not? Let's get rid of these guys real quick. Alright, let me get on top of this crane. Can I do it? Yes, I can. Alright, let's see what kind of shot we get from here. So to access the photo mode, just go ahead and pause the game and select photo mode. So you're going to be greeted with the camera tab, and in here you can change the mode, so either first person or third person. Even if you're in first person and you move the camera just a little bit, it'll automatically switch it to third person, so just keep that in mind. So you have the option to turn on and off the player, NPCs, or any floating messages that are nearby. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the messages. There's no NPCs, so we're good. So your field of view is going to be basically what type of lens are you using. So if you go higher, this is your wide angle, and if the number is lower, goes straight into his butt, this is your telephoto. And of course, just like with anything wide angle and telephoto, what I'm noticing is your wide angle distortion and your telephoto compression. And what that means is, like, let's say we go all the way to the wide angle and we position Colt, let's say somewhere over here, right? So what we're gonna do is focus on that arch that's in the back right there, that's behind that ball in the center. And do you see how far away it looks compared to Colt here? That's because of your wide angle distortion. Now, if we move the camera back, zoom the camera in to your telephoto, and we're going to put Colt where we had him before, just the camera just a little bit. Now look at that arch. Now look at the ball. That's a lot closer. This here is your telephoto compression. And what it does is that it takes your foreground and your background and it compresses it. Whereas your wide angle distortion takes your foreground and your background and distorts it, pulls them apart. Next up, you have your tilt. And this is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically rotating the image. And it's in degrees, so if you wanted to do a full 90 degree portrait, you could. Next up, you have your blur intensity. Blur in photography is known as bokeh. So if we increase this, you'll notice that the background starts to blur out. And on a real camera, your blur is controlled by your aperture. So depending on your f-stop number, so if it's at f, let's say 1.8, you're going to get a blurrier image, or if it's at f16, you're going to get more of a sharper image. So we'll just go ahead and max this out just for the sake of this demonstration. So you can turn on and off your autofocus, and let's say if we turn it on, I believe it's whatever you point at, that's what's going to be in focus. So if you don't have a lot going on in your screen, that there's not like a lot of depth that you're working with, then your autofocus would come in handy. In this situation, it's trying to focus on so many different things that I'm just going to go ahead and turn it off. Now let's say you have your blur set. You can actually change the minimum distance of your blur and your maximum distance. To do that, let's go ahead and actually move from this area. So here we're not really going to mess with the field of view. I just want to show off the blur. So let's go ahead and max it out. Turn off the autofocus. So the minimum distance will basically be your foreground. How far up do you want the blur to be closest to the character? So if we increase this, you'll notice that you get to set the limit of where you want the focus to be. So let's say I want the minimum focus in my foreground to be about right here, for example, right? Your maximum distance is the same thing, but for your background. So if we increase this, I'm telling the background, hey, I want it to be focused starting from here all the way back. If you keep increasing it, it's going to go further back. And if you go the opposite direction, it's going to be closing in. Now, normally with cameras, how it works is once you set your aperture, let's say the blur intensity is at 100 here, let's say that's f1.8, right? Once you have it set and you're trying to focus, your minimum and your maximum focal range will actually be set, and when you're focusing, you're basically moving that one set focal range back and forth. Here, it's something that you can normally do in post-processing when you're editing an image, which you can set the blur in the background and the foreground basically however you want it, and then it adjusts the intensity of the blur. Can't really do that in a camera, but you can do that in some sort of post-processing. So it's pretty cool that you can actually do this in the game. All right, next you have your flash intensity, which we're gonna need to go to a darker area. Maybe, well, let's see if we can find another dark area. The flash intensity is more like a spotlight for your character. So if we increase this intensity, just max it out, there's basically a spotlight on your character. And you can actually choose the intensity and then how far you want the spotlight to go. Imagine there's a light right in front of the camera. You can adjust the light coming from the camera. Now, one thing I'm noticing already is this light isn't casting any sort of shadow. So like if I put it behind Colt, I don't see a shadow right here like it should be. And then same thing with this barrel, this wall. I'm not noticing any shadows after you hit an object with the light. So just keep that in mind. Now, once you have your intensity and distance set, you can actually change the color of the flash. So there's about 7 choices to work with. So depending on the color palette of the scene, so if you're in a very vibrant, very colorful scene, you can change the flash color to match whatever's happening around you. So in this case, I'll keep it on the default white. Next, you have grids. You have a grid, or actually you have 3 grids. Let me show you what they can do. So if we come back here to the crane, set on top of it. So in the grid option, you actually have 3 options. You have the rule of thirds, a phi grid or the golden ratio, and a diagonal. Let's start with the rule of thirds. This is probably the most common grid you're gonna see. You're gonna see it on your phone, on cameras, everywhere. And just because it says rule in the name doesn't mean it's an absolute rule. You're allowed to break it. It's more of a guidance more than anything else. But how it works is you basically put an object on the lines kind of intersecting the screen. So for example, if I put Colt here, we hide this. This could potentially look pleasing to someone. I could do it on this side. I could, raise it where he's in this lower third. You can do, let's say, this whole thing right here. But what we're gonna do is Colt on that bottom line and then that giant ball on the top line. So just use it as a guiding tool. So this one is your phi grid, and it derives from the golden ratio, which this is mathematically, if I remember correctly, it's more mathematical. The easiest way to put it is that this is kind of like the rule of thirds, but modified slightly. Same concept. You would put your character or subject on these intersecting lines, and it would turn out to be pleasing. And then same thing here, if I wanted to do something like that, let's say adjust it like that. Actually, wait, let's do that. That could potentially look pleasing to someone. And then you have your diagonal. So in this instance, I can use this crane, and let's say if my tilt was off, like that, so it doesn't look good. Let me just go ahead and use the diagonal grid, and let me go ahead and adjust it, and there you go, now it's in line. Then you can further adjust it by moving it from the diagonal to, let's say, the golden ratio, and do something like that. Just use these grid lines as more of a guidance. Your next tab is going to be your effects tab. So we're going to start off with some filters. which these are pretty unique filters. I like the sketch one. This one's kind of neat. The anime one, yeah, I like this one. Once you have your filter set, you can go into your filter intensity and basically adjust how much of it do you want affecting the image. We go to, let's say the sketch, same thing. If you just want like a lightly drawn look, you can go for that. Same thing with any of the colors. You can just lightly adjust it, but really the choice is yours. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the filters. Next, you have a few settings that are things that you would normally see when you're post-processing an image, like let's say in something like Lightroom. You have your exposure, saturation, contrast, vignette, and you can also add film grain. So let's say if we do the exposure, this is essentially your brightness. So if we increase it, it'll brighten up the image. And if we decrease it, of course, it'll darken up the image. This is doing something that you would normally see in post-processing. Let's say if we bring down the exposure, notice the light above coal. You're starting to notice more detail in there. If we increase the exposure, the detail's lost, and now it's just a white blur on the screen. But decreasing it brings back the detail. So fine-tune your exposure until you get the detail in the image like how you want it. Next, you have your saturation, and this is more for your colors. So if we decrease it, you're going to desaturate the image. Basically take the color out of the equation. Increase saturation, and you're doing the opposite. You're adding more color. Next, you have your contrast, which if you decrease your contrast, you'll get more of a faded look. If you increase it, you'll get this ratio between your highlights and shadows. If you increase it too much, it'll be more of like a crunchier image, as I'd like to say. So I would suggest with contrast, kind of adjust it just lightly. So in this situation, I would increase it probably about there, probably around here. Once we hit 56, you start to lose detail in the shadows over there. So next you have your vignette, and a vignette is essentially, in most other applications, an oval that goes around your screen and it darkens up the edges. And then the more you increase the vignette, the darker it gets on the sides and on the edges, and then it'll increase that oval going into the middle. In this situation, a vignette, for some reason, is more of a rectangle. And I don't think I've ever seen that before. So it's a rectangle that just kind of closes in and darkens up the edges. I mean, it could still work. That's not an issue. But it's just very weird that it's a rectangle, not an oval. But I guess it would fit the game just fine because the art direction of this game is very unique. So I guess you could just say it's more of an artistic choice. But either way, how I would suggest a vignette is increase it where it darkens up the edges and where your eyes kind of focus more towards the middle of the screen. And the next couple of settings, film grain, chromatic aberration, and sharpness, you can adjust these to however you like. This is more of a personal preference. Let's say we increase the film grain. It's, as the name suggests, it'll just add a bunch of grain. Since this game has more of a 60s vibe to it, you can add a little bit of film grain in it to give more of a vintage look. If you wanted to increase that vintage look even further, you can decrease your contrast to give it more of that faded effect. Me personally, I'm not a huge film grain kind of fan, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn it off. Your chromatic aberration, let's say if we max this out, this is more of like a, in an actual lens, this is more of a lens defect. Like let's say if we get closer to Colt here, you can probably see what I'm seeing. You notice the barrel of the gun there, how it basically just kind of duplicates the gun. On a real lens, unless it's more of an artistic choice, you really don't want chromatic aberration. There's even stuff in something like Lightroom where you can just check a box that says remove chromatic aberration. That way you don't get this effect. Use it more as an artistic effect. Then you have your sharpness slider, which if you increase the sharpness, what it's basically going to do is increase the more granular detail. So let's say we move, let's say somewhere over here. If we increase the sharpness, you can see it accentuating the detail in like the little cracks and so on, but it is kind of crunching up those cables there. So So again, this is more of an artistic thing. I don't think you really need extra sharpness on this. I would say maybe add it if you're going to be sharing those images. Maybe add a little bit of sharpness. That way it doesn't lose any detail once you share an image due to like social media compression or anything. But generally speaking, I mean, I don't think you need to add sharpness, but it's there if you want it. So your next tab is your character tab. So let's say, let me go ahead and move this camera around a little bit. You can actually change the character, so you can either have Colt or Juliana. It's up to you. Let's change it up. Let's do Juliana now. In here, you can actually change the different settings for the character itself, like the outfit, the gun, and everything. Let's go ahead and move to a different area. So after you select your character, you can change their outfit. So let's go with the checkmate outfit. Depending on your weapon choice and the variation, whether you're going to dual wield or single wield a weapon, it'll give you a different pose. So let's do single wield. And let's change the weapon. And you'll notice that she does different things with different weapons. Colt will do the exact same thing, depending on the weapon, depending on the dual wielding or single wielding, you're gonna get a different pose. So let's stick with the default. And we'll do single, that's fine. You can change the weapon skin. So in this case, I have 4 skins, so I'm just gonna let's just pick the brightest one, why not? And from there, now you can change the pose to however you want it. So you can do some fun poses, action poses, signature pose, that's actually a pretty cool one. And let's see how that changes if I go to like signature and I dual wield. Now it changes. Same thing with the fun ones. And I'm sure with the action ones, yeah, you're gonna get a different pose altogether. So you may think, oh, there's only a couple poses, but depending on your weapon variation and which weapon you have, you're gonna get a bunch of different poses. So this is kind of neat if you want to take pictures of the characters themselves in whatever environment you're in. So once you have your pose, your weapon, and all that set, you can actually adjust the positioning of the characters. So you can position them in the X-axis, like more of a horizontal, a Y-axis, front and back, or a Z-axis, which is up and down. So let's say if you have the shot that you want, let's go up. I don't want to get in trouble. Thinking, I think they should move just a little bit. You can move them as if you're moving them on like a grid. So there's a lot that you can do just with the character models themselves. You can adjust the poses, the outfits, who the character is, and then where they're placed in the image. I think that's kind of neat. Not many games can do that granular detail when it comes to the character models themselves. And of course you can rotate the character as well. Then your last tab here is going to be your stickers tab, which you can actually have 4 layers of stickers. So we go with this giant skull. You move it around with the left analog stick, rotate it with the right analog stick, and then you can do L2 and R2 to make it bigger or smaller. Sure, why not? I'm not really big on stickers and photo modes. I prefer more of like the technical stuff in there, but this is kind of cool that you can actually add a lot of flair and personality to the picture that you're trying to take. And then at the bottom here, you have a frame, which you got a bunch of different stuff you can work with. So you can crop in your image, so more of like a cinematic look if you wanted to. And then there's some very, very stylized frames in here, which I think these look good. They fit the game and they look good. That doesn't look bad. And I didn't even try here. It looks pretty good. So I'm gonna go for just one image. I'm gonna try to see if I can get one nice image without barely playing this game, without barely messing with this photo mode. Let's see if I can get something decent. So let's see what I come up with. You know what? I think I'll take that. This looks pretty good. Got a lot going on, and to me it looks tasteful. I would say all in all, the photo mode in Deathloop is actually not so bad. It's very artistic, but I do like how you have a lot of granular controls, specifically with the characters and the minimum and maximum focus distance. I think that's kind of cool that you can adjust that. I think that's going to be it for me today, and I'll see you guys next time.